Thank you for being here, and thank you, Dr. Vanya, for being here. It's such a pleasure to meet you after reading your book.
It's so good to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted.
All right, well, let's jump into it since we're getting late start.
Great.
I'm going to give everyone a bio. Well, first, let me introduce myself. I didn't even get to that part. My name is Dr. Annalisa Durr. This is Journey to the Goddess TV, where I regenerate ancient feminine wisdom for modern women. And I do that with wonderful guests like Dr. Vanya. So, Dr. Vanya Leilani is a depth psychologist, writer, teacher, and storyteller. She has spent decades exploring the threshold where the external shoulds in our lives encounter our own wild knowing and unknowing, and is passionate about helping us cultivate deeper friendships with our own lives as we learn to live from nature rather than obedience to the status quo. Originally from Brazil, Vanya lives in the Pacific Northwest of the US.
Wonderful.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm also from the Pacific Northwest originally, so that's
Oh, wow.
something fun.
Yeah,
Yes,
wonderful. What part?
I'm originally from Seattle.
Uh-huh. Great.
And
Yeah,
where are you?
I lived in Seattle for many years and now I'm in Bellingham.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah,
Okay, right there on the borderlands with Vancouver,
that's
with
right.
British Columbia. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I love it here. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's just jump right in. And the name of your book, which forgot to write down here, sorry. Why don't could you have a copy of your book that you can show the audience?
Yeah.
Let's start with
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
like to start with that because not everyone sticks around to the end. So this is the wonderful book she recently published,
Yeah.
The Flesh and the Fruit.
Yeah,
Go
it's
ahead.
called Flesh and the Fruit, Remembering Eve and the Power of Creative Transgression. And yeah, it came out last fall, and I'm so happy to be here to talk about it and other things. Yeah.
Yes, and I like to do the upfront where people can find it. Where can they find your book?
Oh, great. So it's published by Womancraft Publishing, so you can go directly to them. And you can also just buy it anywhere that books are sold. You can order it online and request it at your local bookstore. So, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so let's dive in and let's talk about this beautiful book you wrote about your journey and Eve. Um, and I was really kind of curious to learn how you reclaimed Eve or why she was what drew you to Eve because in the world of goddess reclaiming, she doesn't come up a lot as a reclaiming figure. I see Mary Magdalene, who's one of mine. Uh, Lilith, you mentioned Lilith in the book as well. So I'd love to start with what drew you to Eve.
I love this question and I love that observation because I found it to be so true that Eve, it tends to be a distant daughter of many different frameworks or imaginations. And she's kind of has this liminal sense about her, right? She's a citizen of, for example, patriarchal ways of being. In other words, they need her so much to prove so many horrific narratives about hierarchy and subjugation. But they need her but hate her. And then similarly in some of the feminist circles, Reeve's been rejected as the obedient good girl in favor of figures like Lilith. And she holds this very in between liminal space, and often is missed, I think, because of that. And so yeah, I grew up. I'll start with saying this. There was never a time where I didn't know that because of Eve, I was guilty, and because of Eve, everything was fallen from divine grace, and because of Eve, me as a female was inferior. Second, as many times, for example, in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, Eve was first to sin, second to be created. And I grew up in a very religious environment and a religious community in southeastern Brazil. And so for me, it was very overt. But since this is a creation myth, and creation myths are so powerful in terms of how we shape our societies and our cultures, even down to our families and relationships, this story lives, I think, impacts all of us, whether we grew up the way I did or not. But anyways, so I always knew that Eve was this figure that had she took the forbidden fruit, and because of this disobedience, we were all from then on out born damned, right? Literally, when a woman then gives birth to new life, she's actually giving birth to death. That's that theory of original sin. And we all begin this journey already needing to be saved. This is directly tied to that Eve story, right? And that's how I knew Eve. And um, somewhere in my early 20s, when on my own journey, I was starting to have questions that were more powerful than the answers I had been given. When I started to have longings that were stronger than the fears that I had, I felt like I met Eve in the way that I know her now, this archetypal mythic figure who transgresses, who disobeys and chooses to feed her hunger, chooses to reach for what is beautiful and nourishing, and chooses to know rather than to remain naive, rather than to remain obedient blindly. And she actually takes the fruit, as we all know, famously takes the fruit and becomes like the gods. That's what happens in the story. She becomes sovereign. And in my own journey, where I was meeting up against these shoulds and against these places where the thing that I was supposed to be, I was realizing I couldn't be. I just couldn't sustain answers to questions I had never asked, for example, and to continue to be a good girl, which the way I define it is just obedient to something else that's not emergent from my own being. Eve met me, this Eve met me, the Eve that listens to her body, the Eve that sees, that looks, the Eve that listens, then the Eve that eats the fruit and becomes like the gods. And she became for me such and is still such an important guide and teacher um, around this cultivation of sovereignty and really about the power of disobedience to set us free. And that
So,
sometimes transgression is required if we want to be free, if we want to live in our own knowing. And and so that really set me off in this really love relationship with Eve. And then later, years later, when I was trying to choose a topic for my dissertation, it became quite clear to me that I would research her, really thinking I would focus on the harmful ways that this creation myth has shaped and informed so many horrific narratives of power over and subjugation. And I did research that, but really ended up focusing mostly on this wonderful mythic figure that has uh, a very magnificent mythic belonging in the earth line of goddess mothers and a really interesting political place, a really fascinating belonging in mythological movements and history. So she just deepened even more for me and continues to do so. And then, of course, years later, then I have written this book. So our journey has been long together.
yes. Oh, I love that. There are so many points I'd like to touch on in there, but what just occurred to me is that, she has, I mean, obviously such a pivotal role in Genesis, in the foundation story of the Hebrew tradition and also the Christian tradition, but yet we barely she's just there. She's like a blip within the whole totality of all of the books, and yet she's shaped so much of what we are supposed to think of as women and shaped the way that women are treated and enculturated. And like you said, like not even just religiously, but there's like, there's secular ways that that's also impacted the culture.
Yes.
And so, I keep coming back to this thought, like, I think what you're doing and other women that are reclaiming Eve, it's so vital. And I wonder what is the conversation with women that maybe are really steeped in their patriarchal religions that feel maybe threatened by that. Like you have that kind of woman that might be threatened by the idea of reclaiming Eve, or maybe some that are like curious, like maybe it's opening something up for them for the first time that they haven't considered before. And I love this reclaiming of disobedience. So I'm wondering, what kind of conversation would you have with women like that if they approached you?
Women that feel threatened by Eve.
Yeah, women, either or both. Either women that feel threatened by your reclaiming of her, or women that maybe feel a little threatened but also curious, like
Yeah.
they would be curious but afraid.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think of Eve um, as homeopathic. She's carried our illness and she also carries medicine for us. Right. So in some ways, I actually think of Eve as reclaiming me. I'm remembering her. Um, I started my research saying I was reimagining her, and then I think remembering feels so much more accurate in the sense that she's there for us. She's stayed there for us this whole time. And when and as I talk about in the book, when Eve was cast out of the favor, out of the Garden of Eden, it really was a part of the great reversal when goddesses were being defeated by sky fathers and cast out of favor, often killed. And which we can get into later if we want to. But the idea is that in the shadows of this story, and Eve has lived on, holding for us so much that has been cast into shadow as we've lived in a patriarchal rule and patriarchal consciousness, ways of being, ways of knowing, the ways and images of the sacred feminine and of the goddess, in this particular case, Asherah. And so I imagine her there in the shadows like a seed, waiting, for a time when we could then uh, remember her. And she's like, I imagine as if she's held these ways of being and knowing for us until we are ready to remember her. Does that make sense? And so
Oh, totally. Yeah.
I think so. To go back to the question, I think there are many things about this idea that threaten us, that are scary because we've been deeply trained to fear disobedience, to fear loss of favor, to fear exile, to fear not being in that blessing from the Father, and so and
Mm.
part of this, we could talk about this for a long time, but to honor the fact that much of this is ancestral and it's been true. We really have been in historically and in many places in the world in deep danger if we step out of the status quo. And so part of that, I think, hits that ancestral place of our belonging in a history, in a long story. And then I think some of it, so I would say, I would honor that. If a woman says that, I would honor that. Yeah, it makes sense that we might be afraid. Part of my research, I looked at the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a horrific,
Mm.
the witch's hammer. In the Middle Ages, it was second only to the Bible. It was written by two priests, and it was about identifying and punishing witches. And it's a very, very horrific book. And I feel like if we want to understand patriarchal rhetoric and hatred of the female body, this is a seminal, horrific, but seminal text because it's really a peeking behind the curtain. But anyhow, in that book, in their justification of the murder of, so many females, they say it's because of Eve, the original temptress. So our fear and our resistance isn't just a personal problem. It's rooted in our context. And then, also then to explore with curiosity, not judgment, but the places in us that are afraid and that don't know what to do with the idea that we might be very powerful sources of knowing, that we might be able to actually learn to trust our own bodies and our own desire, and that we might actually have to make different sacrifices. And that is true, and that we might have to have a crisis of permission and blessing, and that all is part of creative transgression and disobedience. And so I would start gently and with curiosity to say what's really going on here. And in the end, part of your sovereignty is you get to choose the sacrifices that you want to make. And this might not be one you want to make right now. But let's not deny that there are sacrifices, right? That every road has sacrifices. To the woman that's
Yeah.
curious, that's kind of on a spectrum. I'm saying them that I think that many of us have the kernel, the thirst, to tell the truth. And I don't mean truth with a capital T. I mean the truth of our lived experience, the truth of what it is to see the world from right here. I'm this little corner of nature that I am right now, that I want to tell the truth of what it feels like, what I see, what I know, what I sense, um, and not feel so constricted by stories that no longer support, but rather make small. And so I think part of, I mean, maybe I think that's true for a lot of women that we hear that we're like, wait. You know, what? I don't have to be small. I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to be shamed. I can actually be knowing and sovereign. And that is both scary and wonder and inspiring, right? And wonderful. And and so yeah, I think again, Eve is such a wonderful guide and teacher and companion on this path. Yeah.
I love that. It sounds like that she's both kind of archetypal, maybe literary figure, archetypal figure, but also maybe there's something more maybe of a spiritual relationship with her as well. Something that's kind of beyond just the psychological. Would you say that's true?
Well, I think of all these mythic figures as archetypal figures as psycho-spiritual figures, right? And archetypes
Yeah,
are both. And so it's so yes, yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
She's a
I think
way,
that's
yeah, go ahead.
but
Yeah, she's a way of being and knowing and psychic presence, right? That's what these archetypal figures are. And Um, when there's, I don't know if you've read the book, When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone, where the first
mm,
line I think is when at the dawn of religion, God was a woman, do you remember? Right? And then
mm,
years later, the wonderful Christine Downing wrote referring to that, says to remember her would be to remember ourselves. And I love that. I love those two beautiful ideas together because really it's this reminder that we're speaking, in my view, we're speaking of mysteries. We're speaking of mysteries that we experience and engage with. And when we remember Eve and we remember her place, we remember the power of transgression. When we remember our sovereignty, when we remember her, we're remembering ourselves. We're remembering that sometimes we also disobey and become sovereign. We remember that sometimes we disobey and we pay a price, and we lose something. We remember that sometimes the way of knowing is wandering and desire and longing and hunger, and as we remember her, we remember ourselves. And I do think that's a very powerful psycho-spiritual experience. Yeah.
yes, yes, yeah, and reclaiming that hunger itself, that desire, that longing to know. That's what I'm definitely seeing in your work is reclaiming that as powerful and meaningful and purposeful and important for our own, like you're saying, sovereignty and wholeness. But speaking to that point, both these two terms that you keep circling back to, creative transgression
Yeah.
and sovereignty, are very important themes in your book. So
Yeah.
I'd love if we could start by addressing what you mean when you say creative
Yeah.
transgression, love that term, and then sovereignty.
Yeah. So, um, yeah, the art is what I call the archetype of creative transgression, right? But to really pair it, so if we go to the word transgression, it really means to step across, to go beyond, right? That's what it means. And depth psychologists, we love to look at the break down the words. And what's interesting about this to me is that how closely related, at least in the English language, transgression and evil have been so closely linked, and even to see disobedience and evil have been closely linked. Certainly, the way that I was taught and grown up, right? To disobey is somehow to enact evil, and I don't think this is coincidental in a system of consciousness that's about hierarchical power over, right? In a patriarchal consciousness or way of being, it would rely on unquestioned obedience to an external authority, to the status quo, or wouldn't work, right? That's that hierarchical power over. And I don't think it's coincidental then that we equate disobeying or transgressing or stepping across that pre-assigned boundary as an evil act. And so I think to really start with this meditation of, or this reflection on, transgression, disobedience, and evil are not the same thing.
Mhm.
And I think that's important to start with. And so transgression is simply to step across a pre-assigned boundary. Uh, to disobey is to not obey something that was told to us from somewhere. And we see this not only in the Eve story, of course, but Ariadne, for example. Psyche, right? She looks when she's not supposed to look. Ariadne helps Theseus defeat the Minotaur and leave the island. And the thing that's interesting that I'll mention here, because I know your community has a lot of mythologists in it, is that each of these three transgressions is enacted in a really different way. Eve sort of is just walking and wandering, and she sees and she hungers and she eats. Ariadne plans, she goes to Daedalus and she's sort of cunning in that way, and she consults experts. And anyway, so there's these different ways of transgression, but ultimately each of them disobeys. And often in myth, as we know, these acts are portrayed as a crime. And I think, and Jung, other people have written about this, but this idea that maybe because when we do disobey, it feels like a crime to the ego or to the status quo, to the usual way of being. And I think that's an important part of the archetype of creative transgression, is recognizing that it might feel bad. You might feel uncomfortable and even pain. But the reason I bring this up is because for us to really be curious at that place and ask, what is happening right now? Because it may not be actually that I did something harmful or bad. It may be the discomfort of disobedience, the suffering of disobedience, which myth tells us much about, right? And so that can strengthen us in our transgression in the moment where we might think we want to turn back. Another way to look at creative transgression is in the new sciences, like in complexity theory, there's that systems reach a status quo, they reach a stable symmetry. And at some point that symmetry breaks open and something reaches out, it transgresses the boundary of that stable form. And this is how life continues to unfold. And Joseph Cambray, for example, in his book on synchronicity, talks about this transgressive force as being the key to the continuation of life. I think we're talking about the same thing, right? That part of nature, part of the unfolding of life is transgression, is stepping across the thing that used to be, the thing that has maybe held us in the past, but no longer does. And to disobey that commandment of that symmetry and reach out for what is calling. And and I think that this in the sciences, in the myth, and in lived experience, I think we're touching on the same part of nature, right? That sometimes transgression is required. And if we don't transgress, it's stifling and constricting and even deadening. Yeah.
Right, because it's creating anew. It's like, yeah, it's creativity in and of itself requires transgression, requires breaking free, breaking the mold, going
Yeah.
beyond. I love that. I love
And then,
that.
yeah, and this can be big things, but it can be small things. Like, for example, maybe, um, somebody is feeling really tired and decides, this week every day I'm going to take a nap. That might feel really transgressive. And it gets,
Mm,
it's really close in, right? Like, oh, and I actually don't close my computer or turn off my phone and lie down. I might feel uncomfortable, like I'm doing something wrong. But actually, I'm just transgressing a story that says I should live like a machine and never rest. And so it can be so humble like that and so close in, and it is a resistance to patriarchal consciousness. It is a resistance to power over, that can get that sort of intimate as taking a 20-minute nap, so.
yeah,
So
I love
just
that.
from being too grand, it can be right here. Yeah.
Right, right. It's important to see how we can play with that archetype, as you say, in our everyday lives and in any moment that we choose, really. And, I'm also thinking about, how the kind of over, well, there's this like over sexualization of Eve in this way, that through like this male gaze upon her, but that seems to like take away her sovereignty, as you keep circling back to in the book. And so I'm wondering into this question around, it seems that this reclaiming that you're doing of Eve also allows women to reclaim pleasure as their own, as their, as a sense of their own, tapping into their own agency without it even being, it's not even about Adam. It's not even about the snake. It's about, So I'm wondering if you can speak to that kind of reclaiming of, you know, this feminine sensuality and desire in and of itself through this creative transgression and Eve.
Yeah. Yeah, it is so, I mean, it's almost if it wasn't so horrific, it would be almost comical. It's just how Eve has been, this story has been used to demonize sexuality and sensuality, particularly the female body and desire. And because there's so little in the myth that's about that at all. It's just, this myth has been like a blank slate for all kinds of horrific narratives that serve to uphold patriarchal consciousness, sexism, white supremacy, the abuse of the land and the denigration of the land. It's really um, incredible how much this story has been used in that way. Horrific is probably the best word. And yeah, and what we see in Eve in the story, well, first of all, some people are saying it's because the snake is like a phallic symbol. Well, it's ridiculous. The serpent is our oldest image of deity, and it's a feminine sacred, and this is well known. And this that the serpent and the tree and the garden were all linked to the goddess. And it's not subtle. It's it's a bit hidden in the shadows, but once you look, it's not subtle, right? That this serpent was linked to Ashera in this case, but the goddess traditions in general, and that the serpent was telling the truth. Just so we don't forget to say that in the biblical text, the serpent said, "You will not die; you'll become like the gods." And in the biblical text, that is what happens. The gods convene and say, "Now they've become like us," knowing. So, but what we see in Eve is that she walks and wanders, and then she stops. She hears the serpent, and then she stops and she looks, and she sees that the fruit is beautiful, that it is good for knowing, that it is good for nourishment, and she takes it. And then, like I just said, she becomes like the gods. And so the gods then decide to kick them out of the garden because they're afraid they'll eat from the tree of life. Such a different story than they were expelled because they became sexual or depraved. They were exiled from the garden because the gods were nervous that they would eat from the tree of life and live forever now that they had become like the gods, now that they had become knowing. Such a different story, right? One that I was never told in Sunday school, but even though the text is right there, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so Eve chooses her desire and her pleasure and her hunger to feed her hunger. And these are ways of knowing that have been actively and still are denigrated, particularly in a female body. That that desire is female desire has been profoundly threatening to patriarchal consciousness and has been swiftly punished. In fact, sadly, go back to the Malleus Maleficarum. There's this line where they say three reasons the three worst things females can do or be. They say infidelity, lust, and I forget the third one, but the idea here is that um, a woman belonging to herself and knowing her own desire is one of the most dangerous things to patriarchal rule. And desire is proof of a personhood, isn't it? Desire is proof that you exist and that you in your own circle have a perspective, have a hunger, have a personhood. And so desire is a powerful way of knowing, and it's also incredibly threatening to obedience, to blind obedience. And so, yeah, I think returning to our desire, returning to the value of pleasure as a guiding star, as a guiding point on our compass is so transgressive and can be so liberating. I notice this especially when I'm talking to women who have a realization, for example, that they want more freedom or they want to slow down or they want to have different boundaries or more self-care, whatever it is, but they have this light bulb moment of, I see the horizon and there's more for me. And then it's like this moment of light. And then what quickly happens is it becomes this litany of tasks of all the things that I have to do to enact this liberation, to, be more authentic, to be more free. And it comes back so heavy and it happens so fast. Now this vision has kind of just become another reason why I feel bad that I'm not doing all the things I'm supposed to do. And one of the things that cuts through that so quickly is to ask, where is my pleasure? Where is my pleasure in
Mhm.
this? And pleasure
Mhm.
can bring us back to the moment, back to the body, back to the immediacy of the day, and really guide us into, I think, more ease and more freedom when we can so often just exchange punishing gods so. You know? So yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, I just, yes, I also, I want to make sure because sometimes we're mentioning different deities or myths, and I think Asherah is a lesser known goddess. So would you mind just letting people know who she is? Because
Yeah.
it's actually, this is really important. This is an important point that you made.
Yeah, Asher is mentioned 40 times in the Old Testament. And so, like I said, Joseph Campbell writes about this movement called the Great Reversal, where we saw all over the world these mythologies are shifting, right? From um, creation myths where we imagine that we are born of the womb of the great mothers to creation myths where we're spoken, but we're created by the words of the sky fathers. And so we see this in Babylon, Samaria, Tiamat and Marduk, right? All these scenes where the sky father comes and battles the goddesses and banishes them, and then they speak creation through their word. And the Eden story is part of that mythological movement. The interesting thing too is that the Eden story, though, isn't just a move from Earth Mother to Sky Father, it's a move from the many to the one. And so Yahweh in this story, in the Eden story, had to be the only God. And how do you defeat a goddess without naming her? Because when you name her, you admit that she exists. And that's what we're seeing in the Eden story, is that Yahweh had to defeat the goddess. It's again part of this big context that's happening around the world, but can't name her. Can't name Ashra. Ashra was her name. And this isn't, as I understand it, it's pretty obvious. It's not like a hidden, obscure situation. Ashra was known as Yahweh's consort. And oftentimes, archaeological evidence shows them worshipped side by side, and that they were really understood as a complementary pair. And so the Eden story is the first evidence we have. For example, Raphael Patai, who writes beautifully about Hebrew goddesses, talks about this is the first evidence we have at the warning against the worship of the goddess was the Eden story. And so Ashra was the goddess at that time that was mostly predominantly worshipped there, and she was Yahweh's consort. And like I said, she was mentioned 40 times in the Old Testament. And so in the Eden story, it's like her story is written in invisible ink. She has to be named and defeated, but we can't admit she exists, right? So for example, she was one of the many goddesses known as Serpent Lady. The serpent was profoundly linked to her. Eve's name as the life giver is linked to Asherah as a life giver. Um, and of course, Adam then names Eve the mother of all the living, which puts her in this long lineage of Earth Mother goddesses, which Asherah was. And another really, I think, stunning example or illustration of this invisible story. Ashra's worshippers would sit in circle and pass around a branch laden with fruit, and they would take a bite of the fruit as they passed the branch around. And in doing so, part of her power became their power. They would take in, as Merlin Stone says, the flesh and the fluid of the goddess and become more like her. And so this even the act of taking the fruit from the tree of life and eating the fruit was such an obvious signal to Asherah, to the goddess. And so Asherah and Eve are really linked. And Eve is not only then representing the exile of the female body, but also the exile of the goddess from patriarchal consciousness. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I think that's the one of the big takeaways, for me in this conversation, is how you just framed them together, Ashra and Eve. And I want to take back what I said earlier, that the serpent is important. And I also had this thought as you said, I can't remember what you said about Ashra, but I was like, hashtag say her
Yeah,
name,
beautiful.
Ashra. um,
I love that.
and I also want to say again what you had said, just in case people miss it, that also Eve's name means mother of all, or something to that effect. And Pandora's name actually means something very similar, because we
Yeah.
have a similar situation happening with Pandora in the Greek myths, which we don't need to go into because I don't want to sideways us too much. But I think that that's also important, just to so we understand what we're reinstating her as too, not just like the woman that that disobeyed, but the woman that created, because she is the creatrix. She is
Yeah,
one of the
beautiful.
mother.
That's right. Yeah.
And I love that image of them eating the fruit, Ashura's devotees eating the fruit, so they become the goddess. They like ingest her power. And I'm thinking about in the Christian tradition how they have communion, right? It's the same kind of idea. You're ingesting the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't think in Christianity they think that you're becoming Christ, but however, it's the same kind of idea. Um, so I just need, let me just take a peek at the time because I feel like we could talk forever. But I think there's also an important thread in your book, an ecological storyline, because you talk about power over nature, and reclaiming our bodies, and there's almost like this idea of how nature transgresses too. I was just traveling this weekend. I was in Delphi with some friends, visiting the Oracle again, and just kind of noticing the way that nature reclaims, right? It's like trees poking through these, old stone walls, um, and and so I'm wondering if you can speak more to this thread of the rewilding of nature or the transgressive of nature that seems to thread through your book too,
Mhm.
or how Eve or your work with Eve could speak to that.
Yeah. Well, I'll start. What comes to mind right away is to say that remembering that we are nature is so transgressive to how many of us have been indoctrinated, right? That it's not humans and nature. I love David Abram's phrase, more than human nature, or ways that we can even relanguage this division. So even to remember, I am nature. I'm not a separate thing. Everything I need to know about what I am and these archetypal mysteries shaping our lives, it's right here. We are nature, we are a part of it. It's so transgressive, right? But to go back to the story, I mentioned this creation myth as a blank slate for all kinds of horrific narratives, and one of them has been ecological. That now we live in an antagonistic relationship with the land, that we are conquerors of the land, that we are masters of the earth. That this all can be linked in Western thought, particularly Western Christian thought, to this idea that man has dominion over the earth and that all was created to support the human man, really, and so this story has been used as a justification for this perpetuation of this attitude. So that's one way that then remembering Eve, and actually what we see, myths are always like dreams, right? There are many things at once. And the other way we could look at this story is that actually at the moment of Eve's transgression, she's enacting a profound communion with more than human nature. And in that communion, her eyes are opened as she is made sovereign. In other words, she is steps into her own nature, is one way I think of sovereignty, and so it's like a little power, or not little, a powerful moment of almost paradox, right? In the way that we've been understanding that moment. And actually, it is precisely the animal nature of the serpent, that instinctual sense, the tree, the fruit, the digestive juices running down her, the juice of the fruit running down her chin is how I imagine it, and then her digestive juices making it a part of her body that actually set her free. So that's another way to look at that. But I think ultimately, when we return to this idea that we can be knowers, that we can trust our hunger, that we can trust our longing, our desire, that we can trust where our feet take us, that we can trust the voice not only of the animal nature, but of the feminine sacred, of all that's available to us, really, when we walk through any day, that when we remember that, it is in a sense us remembering that we are a part of this mystery, that we are a part of nature. And I think the ecological way of thinking about our lives is so makes so much more sense to me than the salvational way, than the mechanistic way that we're taught to think. And that dividing line in patriarchal consciousness between what's good and bad is which of course Jung wrote a lot about, right? This division, and this transgression of that division, and remembering that it all belongs, and that it's not about exile or belonging, it's more ecological, which means it's more about right relationship. What's visiting now, and what's my right relationship with it right now? And I find that that is so powerful in cultivating a general and deep friendship with my own wild and precious life. Because I can ask my life different questions. Rather than something comes up, I'm like, that's bad, that line, right? I can learn to say, oh, what's visiting? What's going on? What's happening? And in my sovereignty, trust what I experience, and then try to model the ecological way, which is what's the right relationship right now? What's the weather? What's the soil? What plants should be next to each other? And sort of have that kind of imagination rather than a conquering heroic one. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does. And I think, even when you're like out taking a walk in nature, and the phrasing you just used is like, what's arising for me now? Or you might have to rephrase it how you said it. But just like, being in right relationship as I'm like, seeing this tree in front of me, or that we have like a million stray cats here, right? So I'm always like watching the cacophony of cats coming in and out. They always know when I'm here because I'm the one that feeds them in this building. I have the one, and they know that when she's around, they can come by because they'll get fed. But it's just kind of like, what is that? What's arising maybe in this relationship between the I and the I and the thou?
Yeah.
And instead of, I don't know, it is kind of like a musical symphony. That's kind of what I'm taking away from what you said, that we can do that with ourselves, and we can do that when we're out in nature too, just being present with all of the elements right
Yeah.
now in the here and now.
Well, it's so beautiful about so many things about that have been such deep medicine for me. But one of them is that when I really feel into the fact that I'm made of this earth, that I'm also made of stardust, that I'm made of mud and mystery and consciousness and energy and dirt, that the reality that my belonging is so expansive, and that actually no matter where I go or what happens, I'm never going to fall outside of what I'm made of, literally
Mhm.
and metaphorically. And and in that sense, my belonging here in this dance, as you called it, is irrevocable. I'm home. And ultimately, that remembrance of I am nature and I'm made of this, and I'm going to return to it. I'm going to be food for the rest of nature someday, is, I think, profoundly healing remembrance. And at least it has been for me personally. And I hope that it will be also more and more for us collectively. And of course, we have great tasks ahead, in terms of our relationship with this part of nature, with more than human nature. But anyways, that kind of remembrance has been such deep solace and liberation for me. To remember that, and to know that my belonging is irrevocable. I'm never gonna transgress beyond what I'm made of. I can play. There's a lot of space to explore and play and make mistakes. and dance and do all the things that this human experience, this human experiment brings up and calls for. I write about too in the book this experience I had when I was walking on this island, Bainbridge Island. You probably know it, off 30 minutes off of Seattle, across the channel. And I was walking, and a few days before I had seen orcas in the water. It was very beautiful and magnificent. And I was taking this walk, and I was deep in my reflections, about these theories of like, is the earth becoming conscious, Gaia, and what would that mean? I was thinking about the whales, and I just started laughing out loud because here I am, literally a part of the earth, wondering if the earth can reflect, reflecting on whether the earth can reflect. And it was just such a funny moment. Actually, I just laughed at myself. Like, this is so, of course, the earth is conscious. I am the earth conscious. You are the earth conscious. We are a part of nature. This is really, it's not a sentimental notion. It's just what we're made of. And I think that's so liberating and so beautiful. And I think it's a wonderful remembrance for us in this particular moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful way to culminate. And I'm just having this image of Eve biting into the apple as if she's remembering that this is also who and what she is, that this is
Yeah.
her birthright as mother of all creatrix, as human, to honor both her sacred, indwelling sacred divinity, but also her beingness as human,
Yeah, I love that.
as
Yeah.
nature. Yeah,
Yes,
thank
because
you.
again, in the story, more than human nature is what sets her free, right?
I love that. Well, thank you. This has been such a wonderful, eye-opening conversation.
Yeah.
It's been really lovely to play with you and have this conversation. I don't think about Eve that often, so this I think was an important conversation for my own spiritual evolution.
Oh,
Um, so thank
oh,
you.
it was my
And
pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Annalisa. I'm so happy this worked out, and I'm glad to have been here. Yeah.
yeah, me too. And I just want to remind everybody to pick up a copy of Dr. Vanya's book, The Flesh and the Fruit. And Dr. Vanya, is there anything else you want to say that maybe we didn't touch on, or is there any more of your work that you'd like to share with people where they can find it?
Um, I mean, there's always so much we could say about Eve and disobedience and freedom, but mostly I hope we will go with so much friendliness toward our own sweet lives, and really meet ourselves where we're at. Because if we give up the salvational fantasy or the arrival fantasy, this is it. It's just loving. For me, it's just how do I love this life that's been given to my stewardship. And so we go with so much gentleness and friendliness. This is my hope for each of us. Um, yeah, I offer courses that are on my website. I'm about to start one on called Gathering Bones. And we follow women who run with the wolves, and each week I tell the story, and we really dive into that medicine. So that's about to start, but I have other ones too. And I also have a podcast, Belonging to the Wild, that I would love to invite folks to head over to listen. But yeah, it's all on my website, which is drvanyaleilani.com. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And I'll post all of the links to your socials and your website, etc., in the YouTube text box, so people
Great.
don't have to search for it.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah. Thank you so much
yes.
for having me. It's been such an honor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for being here. And thank you to everybody in YouTube land. If you like what you saw, please hit the like button. Please share with all of your friends, especially myth and goddess folk, goddess archetypal interested folk. Um, please subscribe to the channel. And there's always one I always like. Oh, leave a comment. Yes, please ask questions, leave comments. I'd be happy to alert Dr. Vanya if you have any specific questions for her.
Wonderful.
And with that, we'll see you all next time. Thank you. Ciao.